The first time my neighbor tried to get my truck fined, I honestly thought it was a misunderstanding. Looking back now, that was probably the last normal day in our neighborhood before everything started unraveling. I'm Maya Johnson, and for years my family lived quietly in a suburban community where people waved from their driveways, borrowed tools, and showed up when someone needed help. My pickup truck was part of that life. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't new. It was the truck I used to haul mulch for neighbors, pick up supplies for community events, and help friends move furniture. It had been parked in my driveway for nearly 4 years without a single complaint. Then one Monday morning, I opened my mailbox and found a warning letter from the HOA. According to the notice, my truck was considered an oversized vehicle and could be in violation of community parking standards. I remember standing in my driveway rereading the letter while staring at the same truck that had been sitting there for years. Across the street, Narita Collins was trimming flowers near her mailbox. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed someone had made a mistake and that one phone call would clear everything up. But later that afternoon, another neighbor quietly told me he had seen Narita speaking to members of the HOA board during the previous weekend. He didn't know what they discussed, but he said my truck came up more than once. That felt strange. Why would anyone care that much about a vehicle parked in my own driveway? Still, I tried to stay calm. I contacted the HOA office, explained that the truck had been there for years, and expected the issue to disappear. Instead, 3 days later, a second notice arrived. This one included the possibility of fines. That was when I started paying closer attention. As I drove through the neighborhood that evening, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were at least 5 other pickup trucks parked in plain sight, some larger than mine. None of them had warning stickers. None of their owners had received letters. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I couldn't ignore. Why was my truck the only one being targeted? After noticing that other trucks in the neighborhood were being left alone, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the HOA had simply started with my street and hadn't gotten to the others yet. Maybe someone had entered the wrong address. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was harder to accept. But over the next 2 weeks, the situation only became more confusing. The warnings turned into fines. The fines started small, but each letter carried a stronger tone than the last. What bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the feeling that someone had already decided I was guilty before I had a chance to explain anything. I attended the next HOA meeting hoping to resolve the issue face to face. The moment I walked into the clubhouse, I saw Narita sitting in the front row. She wasn't a board member, but she looked more prepared than anyone else in the room. She had a folder full of papers, highlighted notes, and photographs. When my truck was mentioned, she immediately stood up and began speaking. She argued that oversized vehicles damaged the appearance of the neighborhood and reduced property values. She spoke confidently, as if she had rehearsed every sentence. What surprised me was how personal it felt. She wasn't talking about trucks in general. She was talking about my truck. Every example she gave somehow led back to my driveway. When I pointed out that several other residents owned similar vehicles, Narita quickly changed the subject. The board members seemed uncomfortable, but none of them challenged her. The meeting ended without a decision, yet 3 days later another fine appeared in my mailbox. By then, my family was starting to feel the pressure. My husband asked whether we should temporarily park the truck elsewhere. I hated that idea because it felt like admitting I had done something wrong. Then something happened that made me even more uneasy. One evening, while watering my front lawn, I noticed Narita standing across the street taking pictures. Not of the neighborhood. Not of traffic. Just of my driveway. She lowered her phone when she realized I had seen her. But the damage was done. This was no longer about a parking rule. The real question was why Narita seemed so determined to make my truck disappear. By the time the third fine arrived, I stopped believing this was about a parking rule. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every few days another notice appeared in my mailbox, and every notice focused on the same thing, my truck. What made it even harder to understand was that nothing about my situation had changed. The truck was still parked entirely in my driveway. It wasn't blocking sidewalks, roads, or anyone else's property. If anything, I had become more careful than ever. One Saturday morning, I decided to take a slow drive through the neighborhood and document what I was seeing. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for answers. Within 15 minutes, I counted 6 pickup trucks larger than mine. One was parked overnight on the street. Another had a utility trailer attached to it. A third had been sitting in the exact same spot for weeks. Yet none of those vehicles had warning stickers, violation notices, or fines. The more evidence I gathered, the less sense the HOA's actions made. Later that afternoon, I ran into a neighbor named Linda while checking my mailbox. She glanced at the stack of HOA letters in my hand and immediately looked uncomfortable. After a moment, she quietly asked if I was being fined over the truck. When I said yes, she lowered her voice and told me something I wasn't expecting. Years earlier, she had received repeated HOA complaints over something minor involving outdoor decorations. At the time, she had assumed it was random enforcement. Looking back, she wasn't so sure. Before I could ask more questions, she stopped herself and looked around the street. Then she said something that stayed with me the rest of the day. You should find out who decides which complaints move forward and which ones disappear. That sentence hit me harder than any fine. Until then, I had assumed everyone was playing by the same rules. But what if they weren't? What if some complaints were being ignored while others were being pushed through on purpose? That evening, I started reviewing every HOA document I could access online. Most of it was routine. Meeting summaries, budget reports, committee updates. Then I noticed something strange. Several older enforcement records that should have been available simply weren't there. And the more I searched, the more it felt like someone didn't want residents comparing the past to the present. The missing records bothered me more than the fines. At least fines came with an explanation, even if I disagreed with it. Missing records were different. They raised questions nobody seemed eager to answer. The next Monday, I submitted a formal request to the HOA asking for enforcement records related to oversized vehicles over the previous 5 years. I wasn't asking for anything unusual. Homeowners had the right to review many association documents, and I wanted to see whether my truck was truly being treated the same as everyone else's. A week later, I received a brief email from the management office saying they were gathering the files. That sounded promising until another week passed with no update. Then another. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks, I was invited to review the records at the HOA office. I expected to leave with answers. Instead, I left with even more questions. Several files were available, but many weren't. Entire sections covering certain years were missing. Some enforcement logs stopped abruptly in the middle of a calendar year. Other records referenced attachments that no longer existed. When I asked the office manager about the gaps, she looked frustrated rather than defensive. She told me the association had changed management companies multiple times over the years, and some files may have been misplaced during transitions. On the surface, that explanation sounded reasonable. But then she accidentally revealed something that caught my attention. While searching through a storage cabinet, she muttered that she remembered seeing some of those missing files not long ago. When she realized what she had said, she quickly changed the subject. That comment stayed with me. Files that were lost for years don't suddenly disappear after being seen recently. Later that evening, I organized everything I had collected into folders at my dining room table. As I compared notices, meeting minutes, and enforcement reports, another pattern emerged. Certain addresses appeared repeatedly in violation logs. Other addresses almost never appeared at all, even when obvious complaints existed. The names weren't random. The same household seemed to receive attention over and over. Then I noticed something even stranger. A number of the missing records came from years when Narita had been actively involved with HOA committees. I wasn't accusing her of anything yet, but for the first time, the missing files no longer felt like an administrative mistake. They felt connected to someone. The question was whether I could prove it before another fine arrived. At that point, I was spending more time investigating HOA records than thinking about the truck itself. The vehicle had become almost irrelevant. What mattered now was understanding why certain documents kept disappearing whenever they might answer an important question. The following week, another fine arrived in my mailbox. I wasn't even surprised anymore. What did surprise me was the timing. The notice was dated just 1 day after my latest records request. It felt less like enforcement and more like a warning to stop digging. Instead of backing down, I decided to speak with someone who had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else. That led me to Mr. Harrison. If our community had a living history book, it was him. He had been here for over 30 years and remembered board members, policy changes, and neighborhood disputes that most residents had long forgotten. When I explained what was happening, he listened carefully and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Have you looked at the parking amendment?" I told him I hadn't because I had never seen one. He frowned immediately. According to him, years ago the HOA had revised certain vehicle restrictions after residents complained that the original rules were too vague. He remembered multiple community meetings about it, because the issue had affected dozens of homeowners. That amendment, if it existed, could completely change the argument being used against me. More importantly, it could explain why so many other trucks had been allowed to remain in driveways for years. Excited, I contacted the HOA office and requested a copy. A few days later, I received a response that made my stomach sink. They couldn't locate the amendment. I requested meeting minutes from the period when the change supposedly happened. Those records were also unavailable. Then I asked for archived newsletters that might mention the vote. Missing. One missing document could be an accident. 3 related records disappearing from the same period felt like something else entirely. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun go down when I noticed Narita walking to her mailbox. For a brief moment, she looked directly at me. There was no smile. No wave. Just a look that seemed almost nervous. It was the first time since this started that she didn't appear confident. And for the first time I found myself wondering whether someone wasn't just hiding records. Maybe they were hiding a decision that was never supposed to be forgotten. The more records disappeared, the more isolated I felt. Every path seemed to end at the same place. Missing files, incomplete archives, and unanswered questions. Yet something had changed after my conversation with Mr. Harrison. For the first time, I wasn't simply defending myself against HOA fines. I was trying to uncover a piece of neighborhood history that someone seemed determined to keep buried. A few days later, I got an unexpected text message while grocery shopping. The sender was Sophia Collins, Narita's daughter. We had always been friendly, but we weren't close enough to exchange messages regularly. Her text was short and simple. "Can we talk privately?" My first reaction was surprise. My second was curiosity. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small coffee shop outside the neighborhood. When I arrived, Sophia looked nervous. She kept checking the window as if she was worried someone might see us together. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things before she finally got to the reason she had contacted me. She said she felt uncomfortable watching what was happening. According to Sophia, her mother had become obsessed with HOA issues over the years. Narita genuinely believed strict enforcement protected the community, but somewhere along the way that belief had turned into something more personal. Then Sophia shared a detail that immediately caught my attention. Years ago, before stepping away from official committee work, Narita had spent a significant amount of time helping organize HOA records during a transition between management companies. I asked if that meant she had access to old files. Sophia hesitated before nodding. Not only had Narita worked with those records, she had often talked about how disorganized the archives were, and how difficult it would be for anyone to reconstruct missing information later. The statement sent a chill down my spine. Until that moment, Narita had been a possible connection to the missing records. Now she was becoming something much more significant. Still, Sophia wasn't accusing her mother of wrongdoing. In fact, she seemed conflicted. She insisted that Narita believed she was protecting the neighborhood. But before we left, Sophia said one final thing that changed the way I viewed the entire situation. "If you're looking for answers," she told me quietly, "don't focus on the truck. The truck is just the excuse." As I drove home, those words echoed in my head. Because if the truck was only an excuse, then what was the real target all along? After meeting with Sophia, I stopped looking at the HOA fines as individual events and started treating them like pieces of a larger puzzle. Her comment about the truck being just the excuse kept replaying in my mind. If that was true, then the real story had to be hiding somewhere in the neighborhood's enforcement history. I spent the next several evenings reviewing every document I had collected. Some came from HOA archives. Others came from homeowners who were willing to share old notices, emails, and meeting summaries they had saved over the years. What began as a stack of random paperwork slowly transformed into a timeline. And once I laid everything out in order, a pattern finally emerged. It wasn't just me. Over the past decade, a small group of households had received a remarkably high number of complaints, warnings, and fines. Meanwhile, other residents with nearly identical violations appeared only rarely in the records, or not at all. The differences were too consistent to be explained by coincidence. One homeowner had received repeated citations over a basketball hoop. Another had been fined multiple times for landscaping issues while similar yards nearby were ignored. As I compared names, addresses, and dates, I noticed something even more revealing. Many of the targeted households shared one thing in common. At some point, they had publicly disagreed with HOA leadership or challenged enforcement decisions. Suddenly, what looked like random complaints started to resemble selective enforcement. The breakthrough came when a neighbor named Linda called me unexpectedly. She had heard that I was digging into old records and wanted to show me something she had kept in a file cabinet for years. When I visited her house, she handed me copies of correspondence related to her own dispute with the HOA. Buried inside was a committee roster from several years earlier. One name immediately stood out: Narita Collins. The roster confirmed that Narita had served on an advisory enforcement committee during the same period when many of the suspicious enforcement patterns began appearing. That didn't prove she had done anything wrong, but it connected her directly to the system I was investigating. For the first time, I could see how the pieces fit together. The truck, the missing records, the forgotten parking amendment, the repeated targeting of certain residents. None of it seemed isolated anymore. And the more evidence I gathered, the harder it became to ignore one unsettling possibility. Someone hadn't just been enforcing HOA rules. Someone had been deciding who the rules applied to. The moment I stopped keeping my findings to myself, everything changed. Up until then, the investigation had felt personal. It was my truck, my fines, and my battle with the HOA. But once other neighbors saw the timeline I had assembled, they began recognizing pieces of their own stories inside it. Linda wasn't the only person who had saved old documents. Within days, several residents contacted me with letters, emails, and violation notices they had kept for years. Some had forgotten about those disputes entirely until they heard what I was uncovering. What shocked me was how often the same themes appeared. Minor issues escalated into formal complaints. Requests for clarification went unanswered. Enforcement seemed aggressive toward some households and strangely absent toward others. During one weekend gathering, a small group of neighbors sat around my dining room table comparing records. We weren't looking for revenge. We were looking for consistency. Instead, we found more evidence of inconsistency than anyone expected. The conversations that followed began spreading throughout the neighborhood. People started asking questions publicly. At community events, homeowners who had never challenged the HOA before wanted to know why certain records had vanished. Others wanted to know why the parking amendment Mr. Harrison remembered had become impossible to locate. For the first time since this started, I noticed something different about Narita. She wasn't leading discussions anymore. She wasn't confidently speaking at every opportunity. She seemed defensive. At one HOA meeting, several residents politely asked whether old enforcement records could be restored or audited. Narita immediately argued that the community should focus on current issues rather than reopening the past. Her response only fueled more curiosity. If the records were meaningless, why did she seem so eager to avoid discussing them? Then came the moment that shifted public opinion. A homeowner who rarely attended meetings stood up and described receiving repeated violations years earlier, while another neighbor with the exact same issue received none. Before sitting down, he asked a simple question that nobody on the board could answer. How can residents trust the rules if the rules don't apply equally? The room fell silent. For the first time, this wasn't Maya versus Narita. It wasn't even about my truck. It had become a neighborhood-wide conversation about fairness. As the meeting ended, I noticed several board members speaking quietly among themselves while avoiding eye contact with Narita. And in that moment, I realized something important. The pressure that had been on me for months was finally moving somewhere else. Everything finally started coming together 2 weeks before the HOA's scheduled community meeting. The breakthrough came from the last place I expected. One of the former management companies that had handled our neighborhood years earlier still maintained an off-site archive. After repeated requests from several homeowners, an employee agreed to search storage boxes that had never been fully transferred when contracts changed. What they found changed everything. Among hundreds of old documents were copies of meeting minutes, enforcement summaries, archived newsletters, and most importantly, the missing parking amendment that Mr. Harrison had remembered. I still remember the feeling when I read it for the first time. The amendment had been approved years earlier after residents complained that vehicle restrictions were being interpreted inconsistently. The revised language clearly allowed pickup trucks like mine, as long as they were properly maintained and parked within the owner's driveway. In other words, the very rule being used to justify the fines against me had been modified long ago. But the amendment wasn't the most shocking discovery. The archived enforcement summaries revealed something far bigger. Over several years, complaints had been handled differently depending on who submitted them and who received them. Similar violations often produced dramatically different outcomes. Some cases resulted in immediate warnings and fines. Others were quietly closed without action. The pattern matched what many residents had already suspected. It wasn't random enforcement. It was selective enforcement. As more records surfaced, another detail became impossible to ignore. During the years when these inconsistencies were most common, Narita had served in advisory roles connected to enforcement reviews and homeowner complaints. To be clear, the records did not show that she acted alone, nor did they prove she personally removed documents. But they did establish that she was deeply involved in a system that repeatedly treated residents differently. Suddenly the truck made sense. The fines made sense. Even the missing amendment made sense. Someone had continued applying an outdated interpretation of the rules, while the updated version quietly disappeared from view. When word spread that the missing records had been recovered, excitement moved through the neighborhood faster than any rumor I had ever seen. Homeowners who had remained silent for years began requesting copies. Questions poured into the HOA office. Emergency discussions were scheduled. And as the date of the public meeting approached, one thing became clear. The debate was no longer about what had happened. The evidence was now sitting in black and white. The only question left was what the neighborhood would do once everyone saw it. The night of the HOA meeting, the clubhouse was more crowded than I had ever seen it. People lined the walls, filled every chair, and stood shoulder to shoulder near the back doors. Some had come because of the controversy surrounding my truck. Others came because they wanted answers about the missing records. But by the time the meeting began, everyone understood that this was really about something bigger than either of those things. It was about trust. The board opened the discussion by presenting the recovered documents. Copies of the parking amendment were distributed throughout the room. Residents read the language for themselves. There was no ambiguity. Pickup trucks like mine had been allowed under the updated rules for years. The fines against me should never have happened. Then came the enforcement records. One by one, examples were reviewed showing how similar violations had received very different treatment. The pattern that many of us suspected was now visible to everyone. Some residents spoke about their own experiences. Others asked difficult questions. The atmosphere remained respectful, but it was impossible to ignore the frustration in the room. When Narita finally stood to speak, the room became quiet. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't sound confident. She explained that she had always believed she was protecting the neighborhood and preserving property values. Listening to her, I realized something important. Narita hadn't started this because she hated me. She had convinced herself that strict enforcement was helping the community. Somewhere along the way, however, protecting the rules had become more important than treating people fairly. That distinction mattered. The board ultimately voted to cancel every fine issued against my truck. They also approved an independent review of past enforcement practices and new transparency requirements for future records. The decision was met with applause, but that wasn't the moment I remember most. What stayed with me happened afterward. As neighbors gathered outside beneath the streetlights, people who had disagreed for years were suddenly having honest conversations. The walls that had divided the community were beginning to come down. A few minutes later, Sophia approached me and quietly thanked me for refusing to give up. Across the parking lot, Narita stood alone for a moment before several neighbors walked over to speak with her. Not to attack her. To talk. To rebuild. As I drove home in the same pickup truck that started this entire story, I realized the biggest lesson wasn't about HOA rules or missing records. It was that communities become stronger when truth matters more than pride. And sometimes the smallest dispute on a quiet suburban street can reveal exactly what a neighborhood needs to learn about itself.